They say that buildings have memories. Some houses take those secrets to the grave, and they stay hidden until someone finally picks up a sledgehammer. In the heart of downtown Chicago, the old Congress Hotel was being prepared for demolition. It was a massive gray building, a relic from a forgotten time. Most people walking past it saw only a pile of rotting wood and broken concrete. They didn't see the history trapped inside. But when the construction crew reached the 4th floor, they hit something completely unexpected. Behind a thick layer of old plaster and wallpaper, they found a wall made of solid, old red brick. This wall shouldn't have been there. It wasn't on any of the modern blueprints or city maps. It was as if someone had officially erased this specific room from the history of the building. When the workers finally used their tools to break through the heavy brickwork, the air that rushed out felt different. It smelled like a century of total silence. It was cold, dry, and carried the faint scent of ancient perfume and old dust. As the lead worker cut through the darkness with a bright flashlight, the entire crew stopped moving. They weren't looking at a messy construction site anymore. They were looking at a ghost. Inside the small room, time had stopped exactly in 1929. It was a perfect time capsule. A small dining table was set for 2 people. There were fine china plates, silver forks, and 2 crystal wine glasses that were now thick with 100 years of gray dust. A pair of white lace gloves lay on the chair, looking as if the woman wearing them had just stepped out for a single minute. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a memorial to a tragedy that had been buried alive. On the table, next to a bottle of champagne that had never been opened, was a small handwritten note. The ink was faded and brown, but the words were still very clear. "If you are not here by midnight, I will wait for you in this room forever." There was no name at the bottom and no signature. It was just a promise, kept in total darkness for 7 decades. Outside the hotel, the city was loud. Cranes were roaring, and machines were tearing down the rest of the walls. But inside this room, everything was perfectly still. It was a peaceful and terrifying sight at the same time. Who were these people? Why was this room sealed with bricks instead of being emptied out like the others? To find the real answer, we have to look past the dirt and the ruins of today. We have to travel back to the age of jazz, illegal bars, and the dangerous shadows of old Chicago. We need to find the people who walked away from this table and left their lives behind. This is the story of a love that was hidden from the world, and a secret that the city of Chicago tried its best to forget. It starts with a single brick being moved, and it ends with a truth that is more heartbreaking than any movie. Imagine the scene for a moment. It is the middle of the night in 1929. The streets are wet with rain. A man is sitting at this table, checking his watch every few seconds. He has spent everything he has to make this night perfect. He has a plan to escape, to start a new life. But as the clock ticks closer to midnight, the door never opens. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know that the person he is waiting for is being held against her will just a few blocks away. He waits until the candles burn out. He waits until the room goes cold. And then he makes a choice that will change everything. He leaves a note, walks out, and someone, we don't know who yet, decides that this room should never be seen again. They bring in the bricks, they bring in the mortar, and they bury the evidence of that night for 70 years. Until now.
To truly understand why a room like that would be sealed with bricks, we have to travel back to 1928. Chicago at that time was a city of extreme contrasts. It was a place where incredible wealth lived right next to desperate poverty. On one side of the city, you had the golden ballrooms of the elite, where the richest families in America spent their nights dancing. On the other side, they were the dark, smoke-filled basements of the speakeasies, illegal bars that operated in secret because of the prohibition laws. It was a time of jazz music, expensive silk dresses, and the dangerous rise of organized crime. It was a city that felt alive every single night, but it was also a city filled with shadows. It was in one of these hidden underground bars that Frank and Alice met for the first time. To everyone else, they were an impossible match. Alice was the only daughter of a powerful real estate mogul, a man who essentially owned half of the Chicago skyline. She grew up in a world of marble floors, private drivers, and strict rules. Frank, on the other hand, was just a jazz pianist. He was a man with no money in his pockets, but he had a talent that could make a whole room stop and listen. He played in the dim light of the clubs, earning just enough to survive. In the eyes of Chicago high society, Frank and Alice lived in two completely different universes that were never supposed to touch. Their romance had to be a secret from the very first day. They couldn't go to the famous restaurants or walk together in the bright lights of Michigan Avenue. Instead, they met in the shadows of the elevated train tracks, with the loud roar of the passing trains drowned out their voices. They met in the back corners of small, quiet cafes where nobody knew their names. For Alice, Frank represented a life she had never known, a life of freedom and passion, far away from the cold and calculated world of her father's business deals. For Frank, Alice was the only beautiful thing in a city that was becoming more violent and corrupt every day. But their secret world was slowly closing in on them. Alice's father was not a man you could easily hide things from. He had already decided her future for her. He had arranged a marriage between Alice and a man from another powerful family, a deal that would help expand his massive empire. Alice knew she didn't have much time left. She knew that if she didn't act soon, her life would be signed away like a contract. She and Frank had to make a very difficult choice. They could stay in Chicago and live a lie, or they could risk everything and disappear together. The Congress Hotel became their only sanctuary. It was a massive building with hundreds of rooms, making it the perfect place to get lost. Frank had a close friend who worked at the front desk, a man who knew how to keep a secret if you paid him a few extra dollars. Room 412 was tucked away at the very end of a long, dark hallway on a floor that was rarely used. It was a quiet place, filled with heavy velvet curtains and the smell of expensive gin. To them, it felt like the only place in the world where they could truly be themselves. It was inside those four walls that they planned their great escape. They spent hours talking in whispers, looking at train schedules and maps of the country. They decided they would meet one final time on the night of October 24th. They planned to have one last dinner together in their secret room, a celebration of their new life. After dinner, they would take the midnight train out of the city, heading west, leaving their old names and their old lives behind forever. They truly believed they could outrun the shadow of Alice's father. They were young, and they were in love, which made them feel invincible. They thought their plan was perfect. They didn't realize that Chicago in 1929 was a very dangerous place for people with secrets. Alice's father was a man who used his wealth like a weapon, and he had eyes and ears in every corner of the city. He had spies in the bars, in the hotels, and on the street corners. As the date of their escape got closer, the tension in the entire city was starting to rise. The stock market was beginning to show signs of a massive crash, and the streets were filled with whispers of betrayal and greed. Frank and Alice were so focused on their dream, that they didn't see the trap being set for them. They spent their last few days in a state of nervous excitement. Frank practiced his music, thinking of the songs he would play for Alice in a new city. Alice packed a small bag with only her most precious belongings, including a pair of white lace gloves she had bought for their wedding day. They thought they were preparing for a brand new beginning. They had no idea that the room they loved so much was about to become a tomb. They didn't know that the bricks were already being prepared to seal them away from history. This was the calm before the most violent storm Chicago had seen in years. The night of October 24th, 1929, was never supposed to be a tragedy. It was supposed to be a clean slate, a quiet exit from a life that had become a prison. But the universe had other plans. Outside the heavy stone walls of the Congress Hotel, Chicago was being lashed by one of the most violent autumn storms in its history. The wind howled between the skyscrapers like a wounded animal, and the rain fell so hard it turned the streets into rivers of black oil. Lightning flashed across the sky every few seconds, illuminating the city in brief, terrifying bursts of white light. It was a night when most people stayed inside, huddled near their fireplaces, listening to the thunder shake their windows. Inside room 412, the atmosphere was completely different. It was warm, it was quiet, and it smelled of expensive lilies. Frank had arrived early, nearly 3 hours before their scheduled meeting time. He wanted everything to be perfect. He had set the table with the precision of a man performing a holy ritual. He had spent his last few dollars on a bottle of the finest champagne he could find and a bouquet of fresh white flowers that stood in a crystal vase. He had even brought a small gramophone, playing a soft, slow jazz melody that filled the corners of the room. He sat there, dressed in his best tuxedo, looking at the door every time he heard a footstep in the hallway. He was ready. He was hopeful. He was waiting for the woman who was his entire world. But as the minutes turned into hours, the silence inside the room began to feel heavy and suffocating. Every few minutes, a massive crack of thunder would shake the hotel, making the crystal wine glasses on the table rattle against each other. Frank began to pace the small space of the room. The rhythmic ticking of the desk clock on the mantel seemed to get louder with every passing second, counting down the time they had left before the train departed. He checked his silver pocket watch again and again. It was 11 o'clock, then 11:15, then 11:30. He opened the door and looked down the long, red-carpeted hallway, but it was empty. He stood by the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, trying to see through the sheets of rain. He was looking for the headlights of Alice's car, but the street below was a dark, watery void. He didn't know that just a few blocks away, his dream had already been destroyed. Alice's father hadn't used high-tech surveillance or complex traps that night. He had used the simplest and most effective tool in his arsenal: betrayal. Alice had been stopped at the grand front door of her mansion just as she was about to step out into the rain. She wasn't met by her father, but by two large, silent men in dark suits, private security hired specifically to ensure she never reached the Congress Hotel. They didn't need to use violence. They simply took her car keys, confiscated her small suitcase, and told her a devastating lie. They told her that Frank had already been arrested, that he had been taken care of by the police. In the confusion and the terror of that stormy night, Alice believed them. She was led back to her room, and the door was locked from the outside. She fell to her knees, listening to the rain, believing that the man she loved was gone forever. Back in room 412, Frank was still waiting. The candles on the table had burned down, their wax dripping onto the white tablecloth like slow, silent tears. The champagne had grown warm, and the lilies were beginning to wilt in the stagnant air of the room. He sat down in his chair, staring at the empty seat across from him. He felt a cold realization wash over him. She wasn't coming. He didn't know why, but he knew the dream was over. With a shaking hand, he reached for a piece of hotel stationery and a fountain pen. He wrote the words that would eventually be found 70 years later. "If you are not here by midnight, I will wait for you in this room forever." He didn't write it out of anger, but out of a desperate, broken hope. When the clock on the wall finally struck midnight, the sound was like a hammer hitting a nail. The last train out of Chicago, the train that was supposed to carry them to a new life, had already pulled out of the station. Frank stood up. He didn't cry. He simply put on his coat, left the note on the table, and walked out of the room. He left the door unlocked, perhaps hoping that she might still show up in the middle of the night. He walked out into the cold Chicago rain and disappeared into the shadows of the city. He didn't know that behind him, the hotel manager was already approaching his room. Alice's father, in a final act of calculated cruelty, had paid a fortune to ensure that room 412 would vanish. He didn't want to just close the room. He wanted to bury it. He wanted to make sure that no one would ever stand where his daughter had planned her betrayal. By the next morning, the first bricks were being laid. The room was sealed, the memory was erased, and the silence began its 70-year reign. For 70 long years, the secret of room 412 stayed hidden behind that solid brick wall, forgotten by the rest of the world. While the city of Chicago outside continued to change, while the Great Depression hit, while wars were fought and won, and while new skyscrapers rose to the clouds, the dust inside that small room simply grew thicker on the crystal glasses. The world moved on, but the air inside that room remained exactly as it was on that stormy night in 1929. It was a pocket of the past that refused to disappear. But the people who were involved in that night couldn't just be walled off and forgotten. Their lives continued, even if they were broken into pieces by what happened at the Congress Hotel. Frank left the hotel that night and walked into the rain, believing he had been abandoned. Records show that he left Chicago just 1 week later. He sold his piano, took whatever little money he had, and bought a ticket on a massive steamship heading for Europe. He ended up in Paris, a city that was as full of ghosts as he was. He never married, and he never talked about his life in America to anyone. He spent the rest of his long life playing piano in small, smoke-filled bars in the back streets of Paris. Those who heard him play said his music always sounded like a long, slow conversation with someone who wasn't there. He always kept a silver pocket watch on top of the piano while he played, and he always kept it set to exactly midnight. Frank died in 1980, an old man who had lived his entire life in a state of quiet, permanent waiting. He never knew why Alice didn't show up. He lived and died believing that his love wasn't enough to make her stay. Alice's story was different, but in many ways it was even more tragic. Her father kept her as a prisoner in her own world for a long time. She was eventually forced into the marriage he had carefully arranged for her, a marriage to a man she didn't love, built on a foundation of business and power. Alice moved through the high society galas and parties of Chicago like a ghost. She wore the expensive jewelry and the silk dresses, but those who knew her well said that her eyes were always searching the crowds for a face she knew she would never see again. She was physically there, but her heart had stayed in that small room on the 4th floor of the Congress Hotel. What her father didn't know was that Alice never gave up on Frank. She spent her final years visiting the hotel every single year on October 24th. She would sit in the lobby for hours, staring at the elevator doors, perhaps hoping that the laws of time would break and Frank would walk out of the shadows. She passed away in a quiet house in the suburbs, just 3 years before the demolition crew picked up their sledgehammers and found the room her father had tried so hard to erase. She died without ever knowing that Frank had waited for her until the very last second. When the news of the hidden room finally broke in the local papers, it felt like a ghost story coming to life for the people of Chicago. But for the researchers who looked into the history, it was more like a memorial. The items found in the room, the white lace gloves, the empty champagne bottle, the wilted remains of the lilies, were eventually moved to a museum to be preserved. But during the final inspection of the room, researchers found one more thing that the construction workers had missed in the dark. Underneath the dusty dining table, tucked deep into a small crack in the old wooden floorboards, was a second note. It was written on a small, torn piece of paper in a woman's elegant handwriting. It was dated October 26, 1929, exactly 2 days after that stormy night. It said only 5 words. "I am here. I will always be here." It seems that Alice had somehow escaped her father's house and found a way back to the hotel. But when she arrived, she found that the room had already been sealed with bricks. She couldn't get inside, and she couldn't find Frank. So she did the only thing she could. She slipped her final message through a tiny gap in the fresh mortar, hoping that somehow the man she loved would find it. It took 70 years for that message to finally reach the light of day. This is the incredible power of a place that remembers. The Congress Hotel is gone now. It has been replaced by a modern glass tower that looks like every other building in the city. The bricks have been turned into gravel, and the dust has been washed away. But the story of Frank and Alice reminds us that some things cannot be destroyed by hammers or cranes. Love, when it is this real, leaves a frequency in the air. It leaves a mark on the objects and the walls that stay behind. As we look at the photos of that empty, dusty table, we realize that, in a way, they did finally meet again. Their letters and their stories found each other after a lifetime of silence. Based on the truth of what was found behind that wall, we know that they never truly stopped waiting. And perhaps, in the silence of the night, if you listen closely to the wind in the streets of Chicago, you can still hear the faint sound of a piano playing for a woman who is finally, after 70 years, sitting across the table from the man she loved.